Yes, hello. I was wondering if you could play that song again.
Which one, man?
The one that goes bee boo boo bop boo boo beep.
No, man, you're thinking of beep boo boo bop boo boo bop.
Bee boo 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 bop. Bee boo boo bop. Boo boo beep bop. Not bee boo boo beep. Bop. Beep.
Silence.
Boo boo bop.
Ahoy, mateys, and welcome to another episode of I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast. My name is Captain Eric, and we are continuing our sail through the third season of SpongeBob SquarePants. Today's episode is Krab Borg. It is the first half of the 49th episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, and it first premiered on March 29th, 2002. Our writers of this episode are Paul Tibbitt, Kent Osborne, and Mark O'Hare. Our storyboard artists are Carson Kugler, William Reese, and Mike Roth. Our storyboard directors are Paul Tibbitt and Ken Osborne. Our animation director is Tom Yasumi, and our creative director is Derek Dryman. Before we get into the episode, massive SpongeBob news coming out of the newly named Paramount company. Of the former Viacom CBS has renamed itself to simply Paramount to reflect their just overall new company branding. It actually is a pretty refreshing change. It's tiring to see Disney just getting all of this flack for buying up these properties when there are massive media conglomerates doing the same and have been doing it for decades with not a single ounce of the same flack that one single company has for buying Star Wars, a comic book company, and Fox. Like, buying Fox was a big deal, but these other companies like Viacom, have been buying up things for years, and it's just, without all of these different names in place, they can just be easily, hey, this is just now the Paramount company. We have Paramount, the film division. We have Paramount Plus. We have all of these other entities within this company, like Nickelodeon and MTV. And hey, everything is now being structured out, and I think a smart way, not just for them to get flack. I just think in general it's a smart idea. Having Viacom CBS as the parent company name, just, I don't know, it didn't really roll off the tongue as much as Paramount does. And I just think that's fine. So, but along with the renaming of the company, along came with it some SpongeBob SquarePants news. SpongeBob, of course, was announced as the top streaming show on Paramount Plus, but I believe by just a large margin. If some of the numbers have come out, SpongeBob just dominating their airwaves. So we have some projects coming down the pipe for SpongeBob SquarePants. First of which announced were 3 brand new SpongeBob SquarePants spin-off movies in the works for Paramount Plus. The first of which will premiere in 2023. Now, I don't know if the Sandy Cheeks live-action hybrid film is going to be one of those. I would assume so. That's a movie that I would say is a sure bet for a Paramount Plus release. Not to say that Sandy doesn't have the kind of draw power in theaters as SpongeBob does, but I just don't see that movie doing as well in theaters as it could have just on a streaming platform market. It's just a perfect release for that. And they kind of, came out to say that these spinoffs will focus on other characters in the SpongeBob world. So that to me screams like that's the Sandy movie. That's got to be one of them. But along the 3 Paramount Plus movies, we got confirmation that a 4th theatrical SpongeBob SquarePants film would be coming out. And with that, SpongeBob is the only Nicktoon to get 4 theatrically released movies. Now, for Sponge on the Run, for us in America, unfortunately, we did not receive that movie on a theatrical level, but it was a theatrically made movie. It did release in theaters around the world in certain aspects, and that movie was made for theaters. So that is still the 3rd SpongeBob SquarePants film. Just unfortunately by the means as most of us got it's not how we would have wanted to experience that. But hey, we have another chance now to see SpongeBob SquarePants on the big screen, and I hope we can just get away from the CGI for just one more movie. We've had a completely 2D animated SpongeBob SquarePants film with some live action elements. We have had a hybrid 2D animated live action and CGI SpongeBob SquarePants film, and then we had a completely CGI live action hybrid. We can go full circle and go right back to the 2D animation, please. I mean, I love when they are able to show that on the big screen because it's so beautiful, and we got to see a lot of that in Sponge Out of Water. I know I've always said that we were, at least for someone like me, I felt blessed by that. I know some others out there were not happy to get that much 2D animation in a movie that was promoted to have more 3D, but I love the way they're able to add that extra detail on the big screen and to be able to see that. So I hope we get another just full-on 2D animated SpongeBob film. If they want to go nuts and have some extra art styles and do something crazy in certain sequences, by all means, but if we can at least have a decent chunk of it from the original show's animation, I would really appreciate that. I'm sure most fans would love to see that as well. Alongside that, they completely announced a whole new slew of other animated projects coming to Paramount Plus. They are putting a lot of effort behind the streaming service, and as time has gone on, I'm seeing them slowly add back their catalog onto the streaming service. I hope they bolster that up with more content as time goes on, even beyond what's announced. But I've noticed a lot of going back into the well and reaching out for old projects. There's like Beavis and Butthead movies and returns coming to the network. They're putting money behind South Park, which is another 90s property. Well, with Ren and Stimpy coming back to Comedy Central, or possibly a move to Paramount Plus, this is a time to get back into the 90s Nicktoons bag and see what else we can do. Not to do it for a soulless purpose, not to do it just because there's content needed for this streaming service. But hey, if they need content and there's something cool that can be done, hey, why not throw caution at the wind? Let's do this. I now there's been rumblings of a possible Jimmy Neutron return, and I think that is absolutely perfect for Paramount Plus. The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron, not just coming back for like a movie or anything, coming back for a movie and a return to the series, which I know is not 90s Nickelodeon, but Jimmy Neutron is up there in the iconic Nickelodeon status. But they've gone back with Rugrats. I don't want all CG for all of these properties, but hey, let's just get another season of Hey Arnold in the can. Everybody probably wants to do it. I want to see Arnold's take on our current world in their setting, in that Hillwood setting. Let's give the Angry Beavers the finale that they deserved. I mean, how many properties today are completely meta and self-aware, and how the Beavers had this entire episode recorded? I mean, let's just add the animation to it. Let make a Paramount Plus exclusive short, which is just that final episode, finally, animated as HD as you can, not CGI, but like HD animation of the original Beaver short. Maybe build off of that with a new idea. I don't know. Rocket Power. That's a show that deserves a nice little extreme comeback in this world. And I honestly believe the crescendo of all of this is getting back Real Monsters in some way on Paramount Plus, a movie, a return of just a kind of a reimagination of the show, as far as like, hey, how does the monster world work in a place where everybody has cell phones and cameras and there's just so much access? Like, how do they survive in this place? I don't know if you do an age up with the characters and you just see like, how are they doing as monsters 30 years later? But honestly, I would be totally fine with a just kind of soft reboot of just taking the initial concept of Ickis, Crumb, and Oblina going to the Monster Academy, and it's 2030, and now you got to dart everybody, with kids are so desensitized over horror movies, and they're not going to be as scared with monsters, so you got to be a bit more creative with your scaring. There's so much potential there. But going back to SpongeBob SquarePants, of course, SpongeBob still dominating their airwaves, their streaming services, still the #1 property for them, and I'm glad to see that they're continuing behind the scenes more projects, more stuff, more SpongeBob. I'm along for the ride for all of that. But speaking of just streaming services, the idea of how much we are committed to electronics and the cloud. Here we have an entire episode of SpongeBob SquarePants devoted to the fear of robots taking over, which is a legitimate fear that people have. There are people out there who, when they see more self-service, stations being built in stores, and they see robots being driven around grocery stores with cameras, it is a legitimate fear to have, and I understand that fear completely. I wouldn't understand the fear to avoid them outright, but I can understand the thought when you see movies like, I, Robot, or how many science fiction books and other films that have come out over time that have shown the effects the negative effects that humans can have on the programming of robots, and like where things can go wrong. We've been kind of warned by these fiction writers over time over the possibilities of robots taking over, and it's still something that could potentially see down the road, because we keep pushing the scientific boundaries of robots. It's impressive to us. There are those out there who want to see what we can do with robot technology, what they're able to accomplish, and we're getting extremely close to making a robot kind of like Bender. Shout out to John DiMaggio, by the way. Full support right here from the Squarecast and Captain Eric. But Bender in the show Futurama is essentially a living character. He's able to talk on his own and have his own thoughts, and although he can't feel, he's still an AI that is so far advanced that it's hard to distinguish talking with him, between talking with anybody else. He's able to hold up a conversation with you, and we're getting to that point. But certainly at the time of this episode coming out, we were not anywhere near that point. But yeah, coming out near 2002, we certainly were not anywhere near the automated world as we have today in 2022, because we're coming up to the 20-year anniversary of this episode. So 20 years later, are we anywhere close to a robot invasion as SpongeBob was fearing? And the answer is yes, but it's still a slow burn of a robot invasion. We're definitely not at a point where there are giant robots with metal pincers, red eyes, running on batteries, chasing us through the roads. We open up this episode late at night, SpongeBob watching a scary movie known as, I had it written down here, Night of the Robot. Now, what I love about this whole little sequence here, and kind of this episode as a whole, but there seems to be this consistent love of horror movies present within SpongeBob. There's always little nods here and there that you can find that are connections to horror movies. Ones that are very obvious, like The Exorcist, and then others that are not so much. But it's like one of those things, like if you know, you know. And what I love about this opening sequence is SpongeBob is staying up late at night watching this movie on television, and there's this announcer introducing the movie Night of the Robot, and he's got a bit of a creepy sounding voice, very classic. Who's the actor? Is it Bela Lugosi? No, he had like a very familiar sounding voice as an announcer. But what it reminded me of is the long running history of horror personalities on television introducing these movies and being there in between commercial breaks. Names like Elvira is going to be one of the most popular ones to bring up. My personal favorite, Joe Bob Briggs from Monster Vision, and I think currently he does content with Shudder. But shout out to Joe Bob. Sven Gulli another well-known host of that aspect. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, these names that completely sound made up, which, by the way, I saw a ton of the countries listed of people who are checking out the show around the world, and just scrolling through the countries. I am seeing countries on there that I would never expect in a million years anyone listening to any of the podcasts I'm producing, any of the videos. If you are out there somewhere in the world outside, if you're in America, like God bless you, I love you. But if you are somewhere out there in the world listening to my voice, listening to me ramble about SpongeBob and Nickelodeon, shout out to all of you. All of you all over the world. It's a blessing to have so much of the world check out what I have to offer. A special shout out to our neighbors to the north. My family lineage stems from French Canadian territories up there, so a shout out to Canada. But yeah, anywhere in the world, even in America, wherever you are listening to this, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. But for these names that I've mentioned, Elvira, Joe Bob Briggs, Svengoolie, these are people who they would air horror movies on television, and to start off the marathon, because it was usually tradition that overnights they would kind of just batch air these like low grade horror movies together. Specifically, TNT's Monster Vision was a timeless block of content on Saturday nights where they would just air. They would have like themed blocks of different, it might be a Godzilla week. It might have to do with certain kind of aquatic monsters. They would be like really cheesy B-rated horror movies, monster movies. They would have like alien movies, Moonster Vision. And eventually the show evolved to add a host to the program, Joe Bob Briggs, who, like his contemporaries, Elvira and Svengoolie in their own right, would present these movies with a little bit more trivia, with just that love of the art of horror movies, talking about them. It really, like, those kind of characters are almost the preemptive to like movie podcasts now, where you're even like podcasts like this, where you're presenting information, you're talking about a specific subject. I mean, Captain Eric, I've even pitched in a previous episode about having a time block on Nickelodeon or Nick at Night being that like Joe Bob Briggs type character, presenting classic Nicktoons with a little bit of information and trivia, talking to the people who were a part of those programs. And it's in the same vein as those characters. So hearing the beginning of this episode, hearing that little voice announcer, it just, among the other references to horror movies, I mean, Nosferatu, for example, went from becoming a single note gag in SpongeBob to a full-fledged character in Camp Coral. And that's a classic callback to horror cinema. So we have SpongeBob here watching this really B-rated cheesy horror movie. I mean, it's something that it's almost like SpongeBob is watching Monster Vision on a Saturday night. He's watching the underwater version of Monster Vision. He's watching this movie of a live action movie of D. Bradley Baker, the legendary voice artist and just Nickelodeon legend, D. Bradley Baker, getting chased by a giant, very fake looking but impressive, robot. Like, it was built with something, like cardboard and metal, things that you could buy from Home Depot and put this together. A Home Depot or a hardware store, construction store. It looks, it's not as homemade as I'm making it out to be, but it is certainly, the effort was put in to make this look like it's just one step above being completely homemade. But they're basically running in place, and the background and foreground is moving, kind of like how like the old Hanna-Barbera like driving scenes would be in the Flintstones, where the background would kind of repeat on itself. And so they're running in place. SpongeBob's watching this movie. Gary comes in and reminds him that he gets scared with horror movies, with scary movies. He doesn't like them. And it reminded me of one of my favorite episodes of Regular Show with Elo Govna, with Rigby watching the scary movie, and no matter though it's like a super cheesy foreign horror movie, he still is kept awake throughout the night over it. And the same thing happens here. SpongeBob, this is a completely cheesy, silly looking movie, but immediately after Gary mentions it and SpongeBob saying that he would be okay, we cut to nighttime, bedtime, and SpongeBob is just freaking out in his bed. He cannot sleep. His mind is fixated on the idea of robots taking over the world. I don't know about you, but I have been in experiences like this where I remember specifically at sleepovers as a kid where if a horror movie was introduced. Now, when you're a kid, at least when I was growing up in the 90s, it was like a mixed bag when it came to kids around like 8 or 9 and scary movies. You know, some of them, if you liked it, you liked it. Some didn't like it like at all. Like they knew horror existed and they just knew I didn't want to watch that. But there were also kids out there at 8 or 9 whose parents had, shielded them away from the world to such a degree that they didn't even know the genre existed. And I was definitely at a sleepover or two where all 3 of those types of kids were in the room watching a horror movie. Like the ones who love it, the ones who I'm going to be afraid throughout this entire thing. I'm going to have a pillow in my face. And then the kids who it's the mixed bag. You don't know how they're going to take that. And I definitely can remember I don't know what the movie was, but I remember one kid at a sleepover not going to bed for hours, like was completely freaked out over the movie, but didn't say that they never had seen horror movies or didn't say no to it. They just heard like, oh, you want to put that movie on? I've never heard of that before. They didn't say to shut it off at any point, but they were apparently completely freaked out, and their parent had to come and pick them up at like super early in the morning because they could not stop being freaked out about this movie. Like completely traumatized this kid, and it was just a very off situation. Like I said, I can't even remember what movie it was, but I just remember having that experience about like not being able to sleep or being woken up. Someone's parent had to come pick up their kid, and yeah, there's absolutely insane. But I personally have never found myself in this situation. I have certainly found movies that have given me the chills. There have even been some scary movies that laying down at night have stayed in my mind, like the just thinking about it before going to bed, but never once has there been a movie that made me not be able to sleep or really had an effect like that. Maybe the worst one would be Paranormal Activity, just out of the thought of like, hey, well, I'm sleeping. I don't want any of this stuff in this room moving. Do you understand that? But yeah, I don't have any experience in this with horror movies and the way SpongeBob took it. But he's kept up throughout the night. He starts overthinking about his fear of robots taking over. He starts assuming that, what if Patrick is a robot? What if all these other people are robots? What if Gary is a robot? He actually wakes Gary up to ask him if he's a robot, and that's got to be the most annoying part for Gary, because it's just, even going back to that regular show episode, Mordecai being completely enraged at Rigby, knowing full well you cannot watch this movie because you are going to get freaked out and you're going to wake me up in the middle of the night. And here we are, SpongeBob in this situation, waking Gary up, who told him, like, you get afraid from scary movies. SpongeBob in this sequence also mentioning the possibility that his Uncle Sherm could be a robot. This is the first mention of Uncle Sherm, who we would later see pictured in a future episode. He is the brother of Harold Squarepants and the father of Stanley S. Squarepants from the episode named after him, SpongeBob's cousin. Uncle Sherm is named after Sherm Cohen, behind the scenes of SpongeBob SquarePants, and this line was in fact improvised by Tom Kenny, according to Sherm Cohen himself. Tom Kenny improvised that line, and they just kept it in the episode, and they animated it, and then eventually actually showed off Uncle Sherm, what he looked like with a big old watermelon in his nose, a picture that, of course, Sherm Cohen keeps as his profile picture to this day, which, I mean, if I ever have a SpongeBob character, that probably will forever be my profile picture. I completely understand that. But yeah, the fact that we just get this growing lineage of the SquarePants family is really nice. The next day, though, SpongeBob, after not getting an ounce of sleep throughout the previous night, is just bloodshot in the eyes. He is tired. He's freaking out in the kitchen of the Krusty Krab. He's still worried about robots taking over the world, to the point that he's assuming like random piles of items in the Krusty Krab's kitchen are robots. He is assuming the beeps and the boops of the kitchen are robots incoming and taking over, and he literally can't get any work done here. Meanwhile, in Mr. Krabs' office, Mr. Krabs is currently counting money while he is listening to the radio. A radio announcer comes on the air and introduces us to the #1 hit in Bikini Bottom, Electric Zoo, a little song produced for the show by Paul Tibbett on his own with his own instruments. It's a very small beat that is just a repetitive loop of beeps and boops that Mr. Krabs apparently really likes. He's digging this song, and he's enjoying it. Now we head back over to SpongeBob, who gets spooked out by Squidward, and his hat jumps off his head and perfectly swallows Squidward's nose. Like, the hat just lands right on his nose. It's actually very impressive, the sequence of events that happened here. In this moment, we get the song The Tip Top Polka, and it's a iconic piece of instrumental music for SpongeBob SquarePants. Like, if you aren't thinking of the music when I'm saying Tip Top Polka, it's the piece of music playing under me talking right now. Like, this is that, you know what this is. You've heard this before. I found that this piece of music has helped with a lot of the humor in SpongeBob. There are a lot of jokes that when this is the background track to, it just enhances them. It makes them 10 times funnier. I love that piece of music. And this is the episode that I realized that, like, all of the conversation that they're having, like, just having that music in the background, it's just, you can, call it nostalgia or something. I have no idea, but that music has always been one of the best pieces of background music they've had. Anytime it's used at the Krusty Krab, it just kills. And it's honestly, it's like having a cherry on top of the perfectly made sundae. It's a gooberberry sunrise, perfectly made, whipped cream, and then it's like, this is great on its own, and you pop on that cherry and you make it even better. That's the Tip Top Polka for me. Now, Squidward, kind of gets on SpongeBob's case about this robot fear, lets him know that it's silly, it's dumb, and he needs to just get to work. I love when SpongeBob dresses the customer in the situation. He goes to deliver food over to a customer at their table and just asks them if they're a robot, but still, like, places this fear of robots in their head to, keep your eyes peeled. They're everywhere. Like, imagine a waiter coming to your table, not even just for robots, just any aliens or anything, just walking away saying that would kind of sour, I imagine, your meal. Or unless you just really don't care. That's also a possibility. But I'm just saying, if I ordered a meal and the waiter came over and asked me if I was a robot and then said that to me in that exact way, the way SpongeBob does, and walks away, I'd be a little freaked out at that moment. I don't know about you. At this moment, after he walks away from the customer, SpongeBob passes Mr. Krabs' office and overhears Mr. Krabs mentioning that he feels recharged. Now, Mr. Krabs in this moment, it's just a bit of miscommunication, but Mr. Krabs really liked that song Electric Zoo that played on the radio, so much so that it had him feel recharged in that moment. That actually, it feels weird at first to say that, but honestly, I have felt, maybe a little low in the day, and after hearing a song, like something that really picks up your spirits, you can say that you feel recharged. That feels like it's pretty correct. but he's talking to the radio as if the radio itself is controlling the music coming out of it or what the station is playing, and he's calling the radio his little buddy, like, come on, little buddy, you can play that song again. And SpongeBob overhears all of this, and with his innate fear of robots, you can already see where this is going. He now is assuming Mr. Krabs is a robot. He's just seeing all this evidence pack on itself. Now, in this moment, Mr. Krabs does what anyone would do if they want to hear a song play again on a radio station. You call into that radio station. Now, I actually used to work radio, so I have a bit of experience in this. And I actually hosted a show on the radio station of my college that I had, I believe it was just once a week. I would go in for a 3-hour morning session. I think it was from 9 to 12, or maybe it was only 2 hours or so. But anyway, the whole programming was already set for days and weeks ahead of time. I would just have to go in and place in my theme song to be able to play on the air. I would then have a live mic to be able to talk to people. I would, start the music right, as I'm still talking, and then you got to hit what's called, you hit the post, which is usually, if you're, a listener to the radio, you will see hosts do this all the time. It's just a part of being on the radio. But if you notice, when you start a lot of songs, there's not, singing at first. There's usually just the instrumental. It's just the music kind of getting into it. And 99.9% of radio stations out there will talk over that instrumental track. They will make sure that there is not a breath to be made. They will continually talk while the music is playing, and they will make sure to leave at the exact moment that the song starts. Just a bit of an example there. That's called hitting the post. That's day one stuff, really, when you're getting into radio and getting into like hosting, and at least that was taught to me. But anyway, yeah, I was on the radio and actually tried to be a bit more open to the public on the songs I can play. I pretty much, after I gained the confidence of the system and after I was doing it for a long period of time, I felt confident in opening up the lines to let people call in and request songs. That if you had a request for me to play, I would play them. And the name of my show was The Awesome Eric Show. I actually don't even know if I'll play the theme of that if I still have it, but yeah, probably not. I don't see any reason why I would want to ever play that. I was really into wrestling at the time. I got back into wrestling, so it was in this moment of you got to make your theme, and you can, add in these extra elements and make it sound like a radio theme. And I went ham with it. But it was a lot of fun to have people call in. It could be like an hour goes by, and then all of a sudden the phone goes off, and somebody would call in and say, hey, can you play Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen? And I'd be like, hey, sure, that's a song I can head off to the bathroom to. Or Stairway to Heaven, something extremely long. We played a lot of rock music at 107.7, but yeah, it was an extremely fun time. And what's cool about this episode is that this radio host in this episode is not just a random member of the crew. He is in fact voiced by legendary disc jockey Rodney Bingenheimer, who is well known for his time over at K-Rock in the Los Angeles area from 1976 until 2017. Just to give credit where credit's due, Rodney Bingenheimer was developing a reputation in that time of being the first American DJ to identify new artists and play just edgy new bands of the time. Bands like Blondie and the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, Joan Jett, No Doubt, Nirvana. These are like legendarily known bands, and this was a guy who is bringing a spotlight to them at a time where apparently no one else was willing to do so. So Rodney Bingenheimer was brought in to play the radio disc jockey of Bikini Bottom Radio. I absolutely love that. It's just like a piece of a trivia that's just it's sublime to be into that kind of trivia. I don't know why. But yeah, I would certainly look up into the history of Rodney there. It's certainly fascinating. But they got him in this episode not only to introduce Electric Zoo earlier, but Mr. Krabs calls into the radio station to have him play that song again. Mr. Krabs didn't retain the name of the song, though, so he's only able to recite beeps and boops to the radio host. Like, I want you to play that song again. It goes bebop, boo boo bop, essentially. And it's we have this moment between radio host Rodney Bingenheimer and Clancy Brown beep bopping back and forth with one another to try to get this melody down. And the correct melody, according to our radio host here, is bee boo boo bop boo boo bop. I guess that's it right there. This entire sequence is absolutely silly and is just another funny moment for SpongeBob to kind of look in on and to see, Mr. Krabs making all these robot noises, these beeps and boops, and it just further cements his idea that Mr. Krabs is a robot. At this point, SpongeBob is fully convinced that Mr. Krabs is a robot and decides to bring his suspicions to Squidward and tries to convince Squidward of his findings, all of the evidence that he has up against Mr. Krabs at this moment. He heard Mr. Krabs earlier mentioning that he was feeling recharged. He was calling the radio his little buddy. He just watched him beep and boop to the robot himself, the radio. He's having a conversation with his radio and beeps and boops. This is some serious stuff. There's a real robot in the next room. Now, Squidward is not convinced, but divulges into SpongeBob into, hey, what were these robots like in the movie? How can you differentiate a robot from a real, counterpart? And SpongeBob said there's three things. A robot can't cry, they can't laugh, and they can't love. Those are the three things. And they want to test these on Mr. Krabs. So first off, we have, robots can't laugh. SpongeBob calls Mr. Krabs over to the front of the restaurant, where he immediately, without giving him warning or preparation, just shoves the conversation onto Squidward to tell a joke to Mr. Krabs. Squidward on the spot, and apparently completely improvised as well by Roger Bumpus, comes up with the classic pirate joke. Why couldn't you get into the pirate movie? It was rated R, which, for those that don't get that joke out there, if you are someone out there who just never understood that, in America, we have what is known as the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA. And what their job is to do is they are to rate movies before they go into theaters, because theaters pretty much only carry movies that are rated by that organization. And your movie could get one of the following ratings. It could get a G, which stands for general audiences, just like means anybody is pretty much good to see this. It could get a PG, which means parental guidance suggested. It's not really a requirement. There are plenty of kids' movies that get PG ratings because of just some silliness, and they won't turn kids away from seeing those movies. It's just suggested. PG-13 is usually reserved for, the older teenage audience, where they might not let a 6-year-old on their own into the movie, but they just think that, 13 is the age that would be the most appropriate or over. But, these things aren't requirements. Like, if you have a kid that's 4, you can, of course, bring them into a PG-13 movie. The only time a theater ever really hard stops people is at this next one, which is the R rating, the 4th one. R is restricted. That means that you have to be, in America, you have to be the age of 17 or older to get into a rated R movie. Now, you can bring in somebody who is under the age of 17, but for most theaters, and I think most states, to be able to do that, you can't be 17. You have to be 21 to be able to bring them into a rated R movie. Or maybe it's 18. I don't know. Depending on the theater, that's usually how they do that. There is another rating past R that is known as NC-17, which means legitimately it doesn't matter that you're 30 years old. You cannot bring in somebody under the age of 17 into that movie. That means that's a adult level movie right there. That doesn't mean it's adult, but it just means that you're not getting anyone under the age of 17 into that movie. And most theaters won't even hold NC-17 movies. Most of them pretty much stop it at R. The other half of that joke is, other than the movie being rated R, is the fact that pirates are known to say R. There you go. When you have to explain a joke, it might not make it funny, but that's such a classic gag that in the right context, the right person saying it, it can be funny all over again. And it's even funny to defy one's expectations because, you know, one of my favorite pirate jokes is if I go up to someone and I say, hey, what's a pirate's favorite letter of the alphabet? 90% of people will probably say R. Come on, I know this answer. It's R. And every time I get a big smile on my face because I know I gotcha. Like, oh yeah, it's a pretty good answer, but actually pirates are very fond of the sea. Huh? Yeah, not bad. Not bad. If you, not that I created that joke, but if you didn't know about that joke ahead of this podcast, you just remember you heard that from Captain Eric. Gave you a good one. But we get to this pirate joke that, of course, is so corny that even Mr. Krabs doesn't laugh. And there you go. There's evidence that he is a robot. He's not laughing at the joke. The next part of this is that robots can't cry, to which SpongeBob calls Mr. Krabs back up to the front, continually annoying him with these requests to come up to hear this nonsense, and immediately tells him that when Squidward was a kid, his father never hugged him. And this is, as far as I know, the one and only time Squidward's father is ever mentioned in the show. But he expects Mr. Krabs to cry at hearing this, which I think is funny because for SpongeBob, it's like, well, if it's that sad, you think that information is going to make you cry. Why aren't you crying? You know, you're a bit more emotional than Mr. Krabs, and that's not sad to you. But he says this, and Mr. Krabs' response is like, yeah, like, that is kind of sad, but Mr. Squidward can hug himself on his break, which I know sounds really calloused, but that's kind of what we expect from Mr. Krabs at this point, and I kind of chuckle at that response. The third item is that robots can't love, to which SpongeBob calls back up Mr. Krabs to Squidward's distaste over this entire situation, that he wants Mr. Krabs to know that Squidward loves him. And I like that Mr. Krabs doesn't even have a response. He just says, get back to work, and immediately walks away. Squidward is not at all convinced that Mr. Krabs is a robot. He knows that SpongeBob is just freaking out having overwatched that movie, and is going to need a ton more evidence than whatever SpongeBob has presented him with in convincing him that Mr. Krabs is one of these robots. Well, he asks SpongeBob what the robots looked like in the movie, and SpongeBob responds that the robots had piercing red eyes, metal pinchers for hands, and ran on batteries. Now, back in Mr. Krabs' office, as he is listening to the radio, it busts. It completely breaks. There's no more radio for Mr. Krabs. It's not that the batteries ran out or anything. It's that the entire thing busted on itself. Well, the batteries, though, are still good, and Mr. Krabs, as cheap as he is, says something so ridiculous, but that there's still some juice left in the batteries. I'll give them to Pearl for Christmas. Just the thought of Mr. Krabs handing used AA batteries to his daughter for Christmas is just, it's sad, but it's just funny. It's on point for the character. I don't know. I know he's not that bad, but in that moment, it's extremely hilarious. He puts the batteries slightly, he's got like a little pocket on his pants that perfectly fits these two batteries in. They're like slightly sticking out. And right after he pockets those batteries, he decides it's time for a good old-fashioned hard-boiled egg. And he's got, you know where this is going, if you have any idea of SpongeBob SquarePants, but he, of course, has metal tongs that he is using to hold up his hard-boiled egg that he is about to apply with some salt. Of course, I have to agree with Mr. Krabs. If you're going to have a hard-boiled egg, adding some salt onto it is a good idea. Unfortunately for Mr. Krabs in this moment, SpongeBob calls him up to the front again, which spooks Mr. Krabs, causing him to squish the hard-boiled egg and at the same time toss up the salt shaker into the sky, which causes a massive amount of salt to just hit Mr. Krabs right in his eye stalks. Now, I think it's funny that, given that he's a saltwater creature, that salt would irritate him this much, but it was a decent amount of salt, and you don't want all of that in your eyes. In this moment, Mr. Krabs busts through his office door with bloodshot, glowing red eyes, with the metal tongs in hand, and the shot of the batteries slightly hanging out of his pocket. Like, that part is funny because I think the batteries were inserted in a back pocket, but just the fact that somehow SpongeBob and Squidward were able to see those and put two and two together was pretty funny. He runs to the bathroom, obviously, to clean off his eyes, and this was all of the convincing Squidward needed that Mr. Krabs is in fact a robot. He has SpongeBob's attention and is freaking out. They have to get these people out of this restaurant. There is a robot loose. SpongeBob, call the Navy. And while SpongeBob runs over to the phone, picks it up, gets to an operator who hooks him up to the Navy's line, which happens to be an automated message. Which I imagine if I called the Navy right now, I would get an automated message. But to SpongeBob, that just means that robots took over the Navy. He brings that news over to Squidward, who immediately is in emergency mode. It's like Squidward took a complete 180 once he saw Mr. Krabs and took the situation to its fullest extent of seriousness. And after they were done evacuating the restaurant, SpongeBob and Squidward hid in the little front cash register area while Mr. Krabs returned to his office. In this moment, we get this little sequence right here of Squidward and SpongeBob discussing how they're going to deal with this situation, and SpongeBob mentioning having to get poop on the robot. And this, Squidward, has to repeat himself. Did you say that you wanted to poop on the robot? Because they were talking about the movie that he had watched and how they dealt with the robots in that movie, and SpongeBob mentioning something about getting the poop on the robot. But when SpongeBob responds back to Squidward after Squidward rightfully is like, can you repeat that? Did you say poop? And SpongeBob, his use of words here is, yeah, they get the straight poop. Ask questions, get information. And they're all about, using the word poop, which I know is an old slang term for getting information. I believe it's like a 1950s type term in which it was meant for very relevant information, like the poop. They used it correctly here, but I think it's a joke that even if you're here in America, I don't think it's a cultural thing. I think it literally is a joke that you have to know the slang of that time period to truly appreciate it. Other than that, it's just cartoon characters saying poop a couple times, and you know what? That's kind of funny in its own right. Now, Squidward tells SpongeBob, let's get that poop. And they immediately pull out a book that is titled How to Torture. And on the front of this book, they have pictured a medieval torture device known as...
Iron Maiden!
Yes, that's what an Iron Maiden is, essentially a coffin with spikes. I imagine you would close onto somebody, but I don't... Yeah. I'm glad we don't do that anymore, that nobody makes those things. I'm happy about that. Might be those out there who think differently. But from what they learned in this book, they have pretty much getting the straight poop out of people down patented, because they immediately got to work getting a bunch of tools and devices needing to get this information out of Mr. Krabs. Out of this, we see them grab some rope. We also get to see a shot of someone's hardware bench, and what is grabbed from it is a saw and a hammer that I imagine is going to be used for torture. I love the little Krusty Krab calendar that they have on the wall there too, giving us this idea that it's happening in September time. The last item grabbed is a stack of records. I don't want to assume that all of them are comedy records simply because the top record was a comedy album, but it would be funny if they were just a stack of just bad comedy records. Now, using music as a torture device is a known thing. I think almost every couple of years there's a really annoying song that people will mention that it's a kind of song that could be used for torture. And I'm sure as I'm saying that, everybody hearing this could possibly think of a song that, if you if you were to just loop that song over and over and over again for hours or for days, that it absolutely, like, you could do that with any song and it's considered torture. But there's a select few of songs out there that would be those like top picks that you wouldn't want to hear for more than like 15 minutes. Even at 5 minutes, most people would probably tap out. But anyway, they end up not using any of those albums in the torturing of Mr. Krabs, to which they do tie him up on his chair and immediately get into the interrogation. Starts off with Squidward slapping Mr. Krabs, asking him what is going on and where the real Mr. Krabs is. We need the real Mr. Krabs. This beginning part of this sequence I love, because as Squidward is taking this super seriously, it's almost that SpongeBob kind of wakes up out of his trance of being afraid of robots. Once he sees Squidward slapping Mr. Krabs, he starts getting really emotional and actually wants to stop the torture and get out of there. It's almost like he woke up from the fear and realized, like, this is real. I don't want to deal with this. Squidward, like, this is classic Squidward, where he's not into something, and then when he does get into something, he gets into it so intensely, like, that it's above and beyond where anybody else would take it. Squidward turns it up to 11. Like, I got to appreciate the guy that when he gets that motivation to do something, he jumps into the deep end. He was not convinced that Mr. Krabs was a robot, and then through convincing, he is just like, you know what? I am taking over this investigation. I'm taking over this robot hunt, and we are getting this guy. He has to remind SpongeBob that is not Mr. Krabs over there, that is, in fact, Robot Krabs, which is really funny that we have had a previous episode in which Mr. Krabs was taken over by a robot and almost no one recognized it, which I got to imagine maybe the creation of this episode came after that, of like, hey, this would be really funny if they actually assume he's a robot now, and there has nothing to do with plankton, nothing to do with robots or anything like that. Throughout this entire sequence, Mr. Krabs is slapped 5 times. Twice by Squidward in the beginning, twice by SpongeBob, who, once he gets the enthusiasm for interrogating this robot, decides to go over and immediately slap the robot. To which Squidward reminds him that you gotta, like, ask questions. You know, the slapping is there as the punishment. Like, you don't want to get this slap, so you got to tell us the questions. But the next question that SpongeBob asks is, what color is my underwear? And then immediately slaps him. He doesn't even give Mr. Krabs the chance to answer. SpongeBob is certainly not good at interrogations or interrogating or whatnot. Now, once Mr. Krabs hears the line from SpongeBob that he is one stubborn robot, he immediately explodes and is infuriated at the idea that these two think he is a robot. But Squidward and SpongeBob are not playing around with this robot, and they are going to take things one step further, because SpongeBob overheard this Robo Krabs talking to the radio earlier and calling it his little buddy, which means that he's actually friends with these smaller mechanical devices, and maybe it's time that we bring them into the situation. SpongeBob goes and grabs Mr. Krabs' blender. A blender that is apparently worth $24.95, and Squidward pulls out a nice bat. A bat that he is going to interrogate these little appliances with to torture Mr. Krabs, who is only bothered by the price of these devices. The blender at $24.95, the toaster at $32.50. They are destroying his appliances one by one with these little buddies not answering the question, where is the real Mr. Krabs? We get a food processor at $62.67, and which brings us to a total of $120.12 of destroyed appliances thus far. The last item, though, was a coffee pot that, although he was going to say a price that I believe started with a 4, so it was going to be maybe 40-something, he mentions that the coffee pot was in fact a gift and not, anything that he actually purchased. So that's not really a loss on his part, other than now, hey, he's going to have to replace that coffee pot. So yeah, that's a lot of damage there. As the last item comes into play, the last robot in the entire restaurant is the cash register. It's Mr. Krabs' prized possession, and it immediately causes him to cry at the thought of his cash register being destroyed. He cries. He pronounces that he loves that cash register. And he also mentions that the cash register and him had so many laughs that they shared. And upon hearing this, Squidward, goes back to SpongeBob and said, "Hey, I thought you said that robots couldn't cry, couldn't laugh, and couldn't love. And here we are. This guy in this chair right here is all showing us all three of those things." And SpongeBob not only realizes that, like, oh yeah, I did mention those, but now Squidward wants to know how that movie ended. Hey, that movie that you were super afraid of all day, how did that end? And SpongeBob mentions what sounds to be like the worst ending of any movie is that the entire situation was just in the imagination of the main characters' heads. That they found out the entire situation was just a dream. Then the realization of the moment kind of sets in for both characters, and SpongeBob quickly excuses himself out of the situation before Squidward is left alone with his boss, Mr. Krabs, the real Mr. Krabs, still tied up to a chair, having all of his appliances destroyed, having been slapped a couple times by his employees. It's been a bit of a rough day for Mr. Krabs, and we end the episode with him screaming out Squidward's name. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the episode Krab Borg. It's a definitely wonderful episode of season 3. I love it as a continuation of this robot storyline, this like very subtle robot storyline we have in the Krusty Krab following imitation crabs. I like that they had an episode like this that was just almost the complete opposite of that episode, where instead of having this obvious robot in front of you this entire time, you have Mr. Krabs, and just based off of these very silly yet understandable assumptions, going down this path of just complete misunderstanding and a little bit of stupidity along the way. But this is just, it's another episode that shows off that love letter of horror movies that I got to imagine the writers and the crew have, and it's so evident. And I love when they sprinkle in those kind of moments and they can have episodes like this. They're some of my favorite episodes of the show for those reasons, because I would probably be pitching those kind of stories and those kind of references, and I would probably have episodes like this I would want to make. But that is Krab Borg, and this is I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Captain Eric. I just want to thank each and every one of you who take the time out of your week to listen to this show. I hope you enjoy it. Please follow any of the links in the podcast description, in the YouTube video description. You will find links to my Twitter, to my Instagram. If you want to support this podcast and Captain Eric as a whole, you'll find a link for that there. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for your time. Thank everybody who has worked on the SpongeBob SquarePants show, especially on this episode. Absolutely love all of you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you here next week.
Well, in the movie, the hero teams up with a buddy, and they get to poop on the robot.
They poop on the robot?
Yeah, they get the straight poop, ask questions, get information.
I never thought I'd say this, but SpongeBob, let's get that poop!